And now we are going to add in our collisions and our particles and set up hypervoxels in order to create a more interesting looking scene. And right now we don't see all of our trees because I had just saved the file. So we're going to go to the view interface and just click on the move button for the camera to refresh the OpenGL and switch back into Lightwave. And now actually at this point what we can do is go back into the view interface and go to File, Hide View Interface. And now it's currently not open as a running program, and that might free up a little bit of resources, and we're not really going back into view for anything just yet, unless we want to modify the wind options for our trees, and of course set up the rest of the animation. But overall, right now hiding that can definitely free up some resources, and it'll be a little bit easier to work with things. The first thing I want to do is select our object and our valley and our higher res terrain, which we're using to really sort of preview the overall dimensions of our terrain. I'm going to open up the object properties for that and increase our object dissolve to 100%, and that way we're focusing on our low poly, which I'm going to decrease the object dissolve down to 0. And now we can see that showing up. It'd be a little bit easier to tell how we're working with the low poly version, to not have to see that higher one just yet. And that way we can make the modifications to the collision depending on trees, which you'll see in just a sec. So first let's open up the object properties for our low poly. We're going to go to Dynamics, and we're going to add in collision. And that's going to make all of these polygons into a collision object. I'm going to create a new group after we select the effects collision. And I'm just going to call this HV and then underscore group. And that way we're not just working with the default group, but we do have just something a little bit separate that'll be easier to modify. This isn't a very large scene. We're really not going to have any other collision objects or particles effects going on, so we don't need to really separate it, but it is nice to always be ready to set up groups and just kind of get used to that, because if you start creating really large scenes with lots of different dynamics and particle effects, you will need to have separate groups set up. So now that we have the collision set, there's a couple of things to keep in mind, and basically it's what are we going to be using the hypervoxels for? What sort of a scene are we going to be creating with them? And basically, will the hypervoxels be going through our trees or kind of going just above them, and the trees will pretty much stay where they're at, and the hypervoxels will almost go over them, and we just kind of want them on the top. So there's different things we need to keep in mind for that, and basically that has to do with our radius level. Because right now, none of our trees are taken into account for our collision. It is just specifically the terrain itself. So if we needed to raise up our collision in order to get them to go over the trees, one quick way to do this is to just increase the radius and the level. Actually, I'll go ahead and type in a manual number of 1. And what that will do is raise up the effective area of our collision, although we're really not seeing that right now. Once we start colliding with other objects, we'll have a little bit of an offset between the terrain itself, which will simulate that the trees are there. The only problem with that is that we have these valleys. If we take a look, we'll raise up those areas as well, and there's no trees in some of those areas, so that might not look correct. So there's certain things you'll have to play with. You might even have to create another group of collision objects, or even just raise up the polygons in these areas of the terrain to kind of match up with where the trees are, and that way you can get a more effective collision. But we'll change that radius level down to 0. And we're going to keep the defaults right now, just with the bounce mode, which might be pretty much just what we're going to use. And we're going to take a look at the actual particle effect. We're going to go to our camera view, and we just want to take a look at where we want the motion to be. And I think we want it to come down through that valley just behind these trees right here. And then we can have that come through this lower area where we have a little bit of a peak sticking out. And if you want to, or you need to, what you can end up doing is removing the tree or some of these trees in front if you want to be able to see that area behind, or even raise up our terrain on that one area. But that's really something that should have been done before exporting. So if you do need to make modifications, keep in mind you will need to export those objects once again. So let's take a look at our camera, and we're going to see the effective area where we're looking. And we need to have our particles coming in through here. So we can do this in a couple of different fashions. We can have the particles coming from the top and sort of bouncing down and scattering, or we can use different wind options to sort of point them in the right direction. And even so much as using the wind that allows us to have a path animation where we can draw out specifically where we want the particles to go, and then still have them collide with all of our different objects. And that way they're not going through our terrain. So let's take a look at a couple of different settings that we have for that, and different options that we can make for these particle effects. So we'll go to the Dynamics tab. We're going to select Particle, HV Emitter. We're going to call this emitter name main HV underscore emit, and click OK. And this is going to pull up our emitter panel. But what I like to do is just close that out and work with that directly within the object properties. So if you select Objects, go to Properties, and now select our emitter under the Dynamics tab, we'll have all of those options immediately available. So we need to find our emitter now. And we can see that showing up in the bottom here. We can use our controls to move this upward, and either by using the handles or just going ahead and pulling, where we have the left mouse button moving on the X and the Y, or the X and the Z depending on the way it's set up, and then the Y axis, which is currently the up and down. And that's another thing to keep in mind within View, is that the Z axis is up when you're working in View, and most other programs are actually with the Z axis up and not the Y. So we'll move our collision, or actually our emitter, just over here in one of the lower parts of our terrain. And we can see that it's an extremely small box right now. So what we want to do is just increase the overall scale, which we can do by increasing the generator size. And let's increase all of these values up to 3 meters and just see how that looks. And we might need to go a little bit larger, so we'll go ahead and bring these up to 5 meters. And that should be a good start. We can always increase that value or decrease it depending on the way it interacts with our terrain. Because of course a lot of it is just trial and error, and it's really going to depend. What I want to do is just center our view directly on this collision object. So I can just go up to the upper right and click on the center button, which will lock us directly onto that collision. And then if I turn that off, we'll be able to still rotate around that specific area, but not be bound directly to the center. Right now our particle limit is set to 1,000. Well, while we're just working out the initial scene, 1,000 should be good. I might want to increase that to 10,000 just to make sure we have enough. But mainly the birth rate, we might not need to be at 100 right now, since we're just shaping out the initial flow of the particles. So I can turn that birth rate down to 25 per second, and that way we're not working with nearly as many particles. And I'm also going to be creating keyframes for this, but I need to make sure that we have enough frames available. And basically the keyframes will come a little bit later. Right now we want to work out the initial size, and if we need to add wind to certain areas. Let's go ahead and increase our particle amount, or our frame amount. I'm going to type in 300 frames, which will give us a lot of flexibility and a lot of room to work with. And if we go to lifetime under particle for our emitter, we also need to make sure that these particles are lasting long enough to complete the scene. So we'll increase that to 300 as well. And now you can see all of those particles being emitted. But since we don't really have any forces on these particles at all, they're just going to be created in that box. We want them to start flowing towards that specific area through our valley, and making sure we're at frame 0 while we modify this box, and that way we're not creating any keyframes just yet. We need to set up our motion. And I do want to add a little bit of gravity directly within the emitter itself. But most of the actual direction of where we're going to be flowing these particles out, I'm going to use a wind emitter. What I'm going to go ahead and do is change the group to HV group. We're just going to set up that gravity first. And of course, because of the flow, we're not going to have a full amount of gravity, which would normally be negative 9.8 meters per second. And we want to go a little bit less than that, and actually quite a bit less. So I'm going to do a negative 2. And now if I start scrubbing through our animation, we're just going to see those particles start to kind of flow down. And because of the motion, we're really not seeing them progress very far. And of course, we don't have the initial force set into the direction just yet. And we might need to make the animation just a little bit longer, but if we speed up our particles enough, it should look correct, because 300 frames is actually a decent size animation. A lot of shots are really cutting back and forth, so 300 frames won't be that bad. So now we're going to set up our wind. We're just going to keep that where it is right now. We're going to go to our Dynamics tab and select Wind. And I'm going to call this Wind for HV emit. And click OK. And a really good thing to do, which I'm not doing right now, is if you have a group set up for your particles and all of your collision objects, to name those objects with that group first and then underscore whatever it is, and that way it can be a little bit easier to tell the groups apart if you're working with quite a large amount of different dynamic effects. We'll change our group to HV group, and I'm going to go ahead and close that out so we can open that up within the object properties. And I want to zoom out so that we'll be able to see where our wind is at. And we can tell right now that the wind is all the way down in the center, very low amount, so we're going to need to reposition that. And we're also going to need to scale this up, because right now it's very small, being only a radius of 1. So we want to increase our radius to a much larger amount, and basically just the effective area of where we need it. Right now we have it set to 10 meters, which is the max for the slider, but we can always type in values that are higher. So let's go ahead and type in, actually we'll do 30. And now we'll take a look at the overall size. And it looks like we should be able to fit everything into that area of wind and not have to worry about anything else. Then maybe we'll make it just a little bit bigger to get some of these areas in the back if we wanted to continue flowing through. So we'll do 40 meters. We'll go ahead and rotate around. And we're covering almost the entire terrain, but definitely enough of just mainly our collision area. And if we take a look at our wind mode right now, we have it set to direction, which is mainly what we're going to be taking a look at. But if needed, and then we're not getting really the right amount of flow that we want just based off the general settings, we're going to be changing this to path or animation path, and that way we can really define exactly where we want these particles to go and still have them colliding along with our collision object. So if we take a look at the animation, we can see the wind really isn't doing anything right now. So we need to increase its power. We'll go ahead and increase that to 600%. And if we drag through, we can see that the wind direction right now is pointing us upward. And since we're in direction mode, that direction is determined by the actual orientation of the object itself and not any of the values that we have set within the overall settings. But once we go to vector, then we can set where we want the wind to be flowing. And right now it's set to Y, but we don't want to use Y. We want to use, if we take a look and zoom out at our grid, we'll be able to tell our negative X. So we want it partially flowing towards the negative X, but also on the negative Z as well. And that's a very helpful thing to see when we have our grid open, is being able to tell exactly which axis we're working on, because that is very important. And sometimes what I like to do is just create an object on the axes that's very large and use it as a visual representation to always let you know which axes are pointing in which direction, and that we don't have to make any guesses or zoom out at your scene and look at the edges of the grid, because that can sometimes be a little bit of a pain. So we want to know that we need the negative X and the negative Y, so we can type in, the negative Z. So let's type in our values, and we're going to start out with a -5 on the X and a -5 on the Z, which is going to mainly point us in the correct direction, because now we're going at more of a 45-degree angle since we're using both the X and the Z, and we can start to sort of pull this out. Now 5 is a little bit too much, so we're going to need to pull that down. Let's do -3, which still might be a little bit too much, but we'll take a look. And we can see that overall flow is extremely quick and much more than we really need. And we might even need to go below that 1, so I'm going to do a -0.5. Because keep in mind, our power is set to 600. And now we can start to see those particles moving through our object. We'll go back and let's bring that up to 1, because it was going a little bit too slow. But we can really start to see the collision, and we're going to need to zoom in a little bit closer to see that better. But mainly, we don't have enough gravity, so it's not quite flowing in the correct direction. And I want to mainly focus on our meters now and turn down our power, and that way we can take a look at the grid size and think about the overall frame amount and really how quickly do we need them to move over those couple of seconds. And with too high of a power, it'll start to throw off our meter amount, and overall that value really won't mean much. So we'll go back to -6. And we can see it's going through our valley almost all the way, and maybe a little bit too much, so let's do a -5. And we're just looking for the extent of the animation where we want them going all the way to the end. Go to our camera view, just close this out for right now, and we can scrub through our animation and see all of those particles flowing through in all the different areas. So it looks like we're engulfing our scene as much as we need to. Although if you take a look at where our particle emitter is starting, that's going to look really weird rendering because we have HV particles which just kind of render and show up out of nowhere. There's really no size change or dissolve into them and into their creation. And even though there are ways to sort of fake that effect, it's something we really don't need to do. And it'd be much easier just to make sure that that emitter is out of the way. So I'm going to select our emitter and move it down and back to the point where we're not going to see it. And now we know we won't really be able to see the particles being emitted there. Go back to our perspective view, but this might throw off our animation a little, although it looks like we're still going through all the way. But one thing we may need to do is make the emitter a little bit larger, because if you take a look, we're going through a very narrow area, and we're using an emitter that is much narrower than that space itself. So since we want them bouncing off the sides and really getting some nice flow, I'm going to go ahead and increase some of these values and make our emitter a little bit larger. So we'll go to the Objects Properties under the Dynamics for the effects, and now our generator size, I'm going to go ahead and increase the value. So first let's increase the X amount. Let's go ahead and bring that up to 10 meters, which is going to make it nice and wide. I also want to increase our Y amount to 10 meters. And technically our Z does not need to be nearly as large. But if we take a look, we do want to rotate this object so that it's flowing from more of a flat plane instead of at that angle. Although that should work if you take a look at the effect itself. We might want to just go ahead and position that a little bit more. So we'll switch to rotation, and I have a scroll on my mouse, so I can just scroll through and get to the rotation, adjust our heading, get it to point the correct direction, and now we can see all of those particles going through. And I also want to increase that Y amount a little bit more, and we can always move down the emitter, but that way we're going to start to get some collision and interaction with the bottom a little bit more. Switch this to position and just move that down, and now if we watch, we can see a lot more interaction with the surrounding area. Although we may want to make it just a little bit wider, but not by much. So we can increase our X value to 15 now. And that way we're really filling up this valley now. And I'm starting with something a little bit larger that's going to get narrowed into that space, which will make it look more realistic with it bouncing off the walls. If we could bring it up to 20, we'll take a look. Although we want to make sure that we don't have too many particles being created within the terrain itself. So we may have to bring that down just a little. Bring it down to 18, and that should be good. Of course, we have this set to a very low birth rate, so we're not seeing all the particles that we're going to end up using. Close that out, go to our camera view, and just make sure that we can't see where the emitter is coming from. Although if you notice now, all of these particles are a little bit too low, and we might need to bring them upward a little more. So if we take a look at the position of our overall emitter, we can see everything's really getting kind of squished down, and we don't have the values coming up as much. So one thing I do want to do is increase the bounce amount on our collision object, which will also bring all these particles kind of flying up and over, rather than having them conform entirely to the terrain. So we'll select our objects, choose our terrain low poly, which is our collision, go to its properties, and we have the bounce and bind power. I'm going to increase this amount to 500%, and we're going to go ahead and move our particles through and see what happens. Now we can start to see the particles coming out a little bit more. If we go to our camera view and watch that, and we can see that all of those particles are really bouncing up now and we can start to see them really flowing through the valley, and it looks a lot better. I'm going to go back into our perspective, and now we're going to modify the emitter. We're going to increase that amount and the birth rate. Right now we have 25. Let's go ahead and increase this to 100, and we can watch all of these bouncing off. One thing you notice is we have some of these particles that are just really flying off the different areas, maybe going a little bit too quickly. So we're going to go back to our low poly collision and decrease that bind power. If we need to, we can use another force or even decrease gravity on the main emitter itself in order to get those particles to fly up and come up a little bit more. So we're going to increase this value to 275, and we can start to watch that and see that it is a little bit better. I'm going to increase the friction power, which will bounce them around a little bit more, and we'll do 25 to start with and kind of scrub through. And now what we're seeing is the particles not really coming out as much as we need to. Bring that down to 5. And we'll use something else other than friction to hold them back. So we'll go ahead and change the roughness. And since we're working with a terrain, it'll be a little bit rougher, and we want to diffuse these particles a little more. So we can increase the roughness value. Let's go ahead and do 25% to start with. And now we can see a much better animation, although we may need to decrease that roughness a little bit. We'll try it with 10%. And now we can see everything bouncing, and it looks really nice. So we can go to our camera view and just see where all these particles are going. And we have them coming through, although some of them are really flying off, and we don't want that to happen because that is really going to screw up the look of the entire effect. And messing around with the roughness and of course gravity effects and all the different other settings can really affect this. So we can see those coming through. We have that nice burst when they hit that first rock, and then there's enough gravity where they start to come down again. So that looks pretty good right now. We'll go back and select our emitter, and we're going to increase that particle amount and the birth rate. This time we'll increase the birth rate up to 350 to get a better idea with more particles. Then we can start to scrub through and see all those particles coming through, and just making sure that everything looks correct. And if we want to too, what we can do is create another wind emitter to have it coming through this specific area, and that way we can break it up. Or what we might need to do is increase the gravity effect. And let's try -3 and start moving those through the scene. And now it's a little bit lower, which looks good since we'll have a nice radius on our particles for hypervoxels. But we also don't see it flowing through this area. If we take a look in the perspective view and really get a good look at all of our particles, we can see that we may want to break that up just a bit. And although they do start to kind of come through, it's not quite enough. And what I can do as well is just increase our wind a little. So let's go for the wind, select those wind options, go to our vector, and we're going to increase the value to 6, and just see how far these particles will make it, and whether or not they start to spread out a little bit more. And that definitely looks a lot better. where we can start to see them coming through those other openings rather than all staying in the same place. And as we increase our particle amount, we'll of course see a lot more of that and a lot more of them. So we can go back and select our emitter now, increase our birth rate. I'm going to go all the way up to 600 this time, just to get a bit more. And now, since we're working with a lot more particles, we need to increase our particle limit. One thing I like to do is just max it out, which I can do just by typing in a bunch of 9s, hit enter, and of course that brought us to a negative value. So I will max it out with the slider, which only seems to have 10,000. So let's go ahead and just type in a larger value manually, where we can set it up for 1,000,000 particles. And that way, we'll never run out, because we're controlling our birth rate enough to where we're not going to have too many to crash our scene. But I do want to make sure that those are always there, and we're not going to have any decreased amounts because of birth value. So it's always good to have that value set. We can go ahead and scrub through. We'll also be calculating this in a sec. But I just want to take a look at this value, which we are also noticing those bounce effects really harshly coming off, which we may need to adjust. And some of that has to do with the fact that we have a really low poly collision, and because of those flat planes, it's not really allowed to roll over the area, but it definitely produces a much quicker collision. And we'll just take a look after we calculate it and see how well everything is blending up and whether or not we need to make more changes in order to get this to look more realistic.